right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Today, you are going to learn specific strategies to close the generational gap and lead inclusively across generations. I will be your host. My name is Stephen Van Cohen. I'm the co-founder of Sync Learning Experiences, and I am just super glad to be here with you today. Today's content is powered by Sync Learning Experiences, where we create lasting learning experiences for companies' #1 asset, their people, by delivering LMS courses, live workshops, and custom learning and development solutions. Unfortunately, most training is neglected, disliked, and forgotten, but our learning solutions are actually used, enjoyed, and applied by some of today's leading companies, such as Salesforce, the Home Depot, John Deere, and many more. You can learn more about SyncLX by going to synklx.com. Now, to introduce Mr. Ryan Jenkins, who is going to be your speaker today. Ryan is an internationally recognized keynote speaker and author on the topics of leadership, generational differences, and the future of work. His work has been featured in Forbes, Fast Company, The Wall Street Journal, and CNN Business. He is the co-founder of Sync Learning Experiences and hosts the podcast, The Future of Learning and Development, where he interviews many of the top CLOs at many of the largest companies in the world. Feel free to subscribe to the Future of Learning and Development podcast, wherever you get your podcasts. Ryan lives in Atlanta, Georgia, with his wife, his 3 children, and his yellow Labrador. Ryan, take it away.
Thanks, Steve. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for your time and your attention. I know there's been a lot of webinars going on these days, so we're so glad that you're here. I want to start here. Did you know that 52% of workers say they're least likely to get along with someone from another generation? And unfortunately, that trend is not slowing down because 62% of Generation Z, which is the youngest generation in the workforce, they anticipate challenges working with baby boomers and Generation X, yet only 5% of Generation Z anticipate challenges working with millennials. So it's very clear here, the data is very clear that there is a gap between the established generations and the emerging generations. And if you and I aren't careful, and if we're not aware that that gap exists, and then we're not equipped with strategies to close that gap, you and I are going to find ourselves more and more disconnected from the folks that we're leading, from the customers and clients that we serve, from our colleagues and coworkers. So this is why it's a relevant conversation, and I'm so glad you and I are having it today. And the goal today is to close that gap, and I'm going to give some strategies to close that gap. So let me cover some agenda and some brief housekeeping. We're going to talk about generations, give you an overview, and give you some idea of the importance of generations, specifically right now in the times that we're in. Then I'm going to give you some specific strategies to lead across generations, and we should have plenty of time for your questions. So be thinking about your questions, and we'll take those at the end. A couple housekeeping things. Following the webinar, you're going to get the copies of these slides. You're going to get our contact information, and you're going to get some really neat bonuses, one of which is including a copy of my book. So one of you is going to win a copy of my book, and we'll pick the winners at the end for those that are still with us. So stay tuned. All right, we're gonna do some live polling today. So pull out an internet connected device, tablet, phone, or open up a new browser and go to this link, pollev.com/live poll. So again, you can use your device, you can open up a new browser. I'm not afraid of losing you to any of the interesting things on the internet because we got a lot of really great stuff to show you. So go to that link. Here's what's going to happen. When I prompt the polling slides, you'll simply see the question and the options, the potential right answers, and you simply tap or click whatever response you believe to be correct. All right, you ready? The first question is simply, what is your generation? And I too am going to play along. And my generation is millennials. And of course, usually millennials, if I can move the slide fast enough where no one's chimed in, it's millennials or Gen Z that come in first, right? Because I didn't have to tell any of them to pull out their device or open a new tab. They were already there. So, of course, we're talking about generations today. So I want to get a makeup of who's with us today. And this will be insightful for all those engaged in the session as well. If you're watching this in the future, hello, I hope the future is looking a lot better than it is today. And you won't be able to engage live, but you will be able to see the folks that are engaged in this live session, and the responses should nonetheless be insightful. So this is great. We've got 3 generations represented, no Gen Z. So good, the door's wide open. We can really lean into that generation. And these are the 4 generations we're gonna be talking about today. So that's great. Mostly millennials, followed by Gen X and boomers. Keep those devices out and those browsers open, because we'll be using this throughout our time together. So here's a snapshot of the generations. Middle column is done by age as of this year. On the right side, that's how large the generations were at their peak. You'll notice there's 2 asterisks on the bottom right. That's because those generations aren't that large anymore, unfortunately, due to folks passing away. But it gives us an idea of how the generations have stacked up over the years. And what's really fascinating about COVID-19 and everything happening right now is this event is pivotal for defining generations. So we now have an end cap to the Generation Z generation. So the generation that's coming after Generation Z, they either won't remember COVID-19 or they won't have been born yet during the COVID-19 pandemic. So really fascinating times that you and I are finding ourselves in. But yeah, this is a monumental moment that's really going to shape Gen Z and creates an endpoint to Generation Z. So these are the generations. Now, anytime you and I are talking about generations today and in the future, it is absolutely critical that we note this. Generations are clues. They're not absolutes. They are clues, not absolutes. But after our time together, I think you're going to agree with me that they are very big clues on how you lead, communicate, recruit, sell. The better understanding you and I have of each generation, the better equipped we are to lead, communicate, collaborate, fill in the blank. But don't forget, today and moving forward in the future, they are clues, they are not absolutes. Let's talk a little bit about why we're experiencing this rise in generational tensions. The global average human lifespan in 1900 was 31 years old. Isn't that crazy? Now, keep in mind, that's the global average. It's not the average between both male and female. That is the average. And the global average human lifespan in 2020 is 72 years old. So for those doing the math, that's a 41-year increase. Pretty astounding. So now to melt your minds even further, research tells us the first person to celebrate their 150th birthday has already been born. So imagine for just a second, what would it look like, or perhaps more importantly, what would it feel like to have a midlife crisis at the age of 75? Really hard to imagine, right? Because of advances in technology and advances in medicine, we are living longer, no doubt. And so if we're living longer, we're going to be working longer. So you're working across 4 different generations today, but in the very near future, we're going to be working across 5, 6, 7 different generations in the very near future. So any tensions that you and I have working, leading, communicating across generations is only going to intensify moving forward. So this, my friends, is why this is a conversation that is so critical. It's so relevant. And again, it's only going to intensify moving forward. So this is why we got to have it today. And I'm so glad you took the time out of your busy schedule to spend it with us. We're going to give you some really good insights here. So here's a breakdown of the generations in the workforce. As of 2020, this is the makeup. 2016 was the first year that millennials became the dominant generation in the workforce. Now Generation Z is the next generation poised to enter the workforce. So by 2025, this will be the makeup of the workforce. Now this is a global trend. 3 out of 4 workers around the globe will be of the emerging generations. And so I want you to just think about the way in which you work today, and I want you to compare it with just 5 years ago. I bet a lot's changed in those 5 years. Of course, in 2020, a lot's changed. Probably enough change for any of us to deal with in a lifetime. But just in those 5 years, even think pre-COVID, pre-pandemic, a lot's changed, right? Probably the pace of your work, the different technology you're using, how you're communicating, a lot's probably changed in those 5 years. So if you fast forward to 2025, when more and more digital natives are stepping into decision-making roles, how does the world of work change? My gut says, I'm sure your gut's telling you the same thing, there'll be a lot of change. And so part of the reason why it's so important to understand these generations, specifically the emerging generations, is because they give us data points into what's next. And so we can better position our organization, our leadership to thrive in the very turbulent future that awaits all of us. So this hopefully gives you a little bit of more context again as to why this is an important conversation. Let's do another poll. You shouldn't have to hit the refresh button. You shouldn't even have to hit the back button. You should see this poll now showing up on whatever device or window that you are interacting with the poll on. And if you're just now joining us, if you visit the link at the top of the slides that you see there, you'll be able to interact with us live. So visit that link and then select whatever answer you believe to be correct. Now, I'm curious, what do you think goes in the blank here? 77% of the emerging generations said that a company's level of blank affects their decision to work there. So it looks like over half of you say employee engagement. There's probably a case to be made for any one of these responses, but the correct answer is diversity. Diversity is the correct answer. And of course, as we're talking about leading inclusively in this session, that's a big deal. And so it's very top of mind for the emerging generation, which is why this is such a relevant conversation. So why do generations matter? Well, diversity spurs innovation. Let's look at some of these points and some interesting data. So generational diversity creates diversity of thought or cognitive diversity. That's one of the massive benefits of diversity, is that you can approach a problem with a diverse team that has different ways of thinking, has different experiences and perspectives, and thus you can problem solve faster. And cognitive diversity creates a wellspring of creativity. And I think we're all on the same page that we're going to have to be more creative, more innovative in the future. And thus a diverse team gives you a leg up when it comes to innovating. And then a diverse team enhances innovation by 20% for all the reasons we just stated. And it also reduces risk by 30%. Because again, you're tapping into this cognitive diversity. People think differently, they have different experiences, perspectives. So if you can harness those on a generationally diverse team, again, you can problem solve faster, innovation goes up, risk goes down. And ultimately, you know this to be true, like-minded teams maintain, but it's the diverse teams that innovate. And now, more than ever, and moving forward in the future, we're gonna have to be agile. We're gonna have to be constantly innovating, and diversity helps us get that job done. All right, let's look at how we can overcome generational bias. And whether you know it or not, we all have it, right? We all have some level of degree of generational bias. And for a far majority of us, it's unconscious, right? It's an unconscious bias, but it's still operating in the background, influencing our decisions. So we've got to work a little bit harder to make sure that we can overcome these biases. And I'd love to look at this quote from the 16th US President, Abraham Lincoln, who once said, "I don't like that man. I must get to know him better." What a great quote, especially as it relates to overcoming generational bias. And you all know this to be true. There's a wealth of information, but today there's a poverty of understanding. And that's one of the unique challenges now that the world's information has been curated into a blank search box. And in today's high flux and info inundated and multi-generational world, it demands that we seek more understanding. Now, this is really hard for you and I, because as humans, our brain loves efficiency. Our brain wants to conserve energy. And for it to do that, it often likes to jump to conclusions. It likes to fill in the blanks really quickly, and that can oftentimes isolate, exclude. There's a lot of judgment that can happen in that quick assumption. So you and I, to be more open-minded and to overcome these generational bias, we actually have to fight against our own human nature to remain more open-minded, which is hard to do. And that's why you and I don't like change. And that's why we often have these unconscious bias that influence our decisions. So ultimately, we've got to understand this, that if we don't like that view, that technology, that policy, or that generation, we've got to get to know it better. That's why I applaud you for joining this session, is because you have a knack for wanting to understand this and wrap your heads around it in a more unique way. So we've got to get to know it better. And if I was to take this one step further, how to overcome our generational bias, I would sum it up like this. We need to be more curious and less certain. We need to be more curious and less certain. And perhaps some of us are finding this to be easier now than ever before because the future is so uncertain. we're less certain by default. But ultimately, this is the posture we need to take moving forward. As things continuously innovate and change at a more rapid rate, we need to take a posture of curiosity and let certainty take a backseat. All right, my friends, hopefully that gave us just a little bit overview of generations, why it's an important conversation. Hopefully we're all on the same page. And now I want to give you some actionable strategies that you can enact tomorrow or today. So let's kick things off with another poll. What do you think goes in the blank here? 74% of Generation Z believe jobs should have blank. Interesting. It seems like most of you are all in on options for remote working, which of course, considering the times, I think that's top of mind for all of us. But greater meaning has just now surpassed options for remote working, and the correct answer is greater meaning. Greater meaning. There you go. Some of you are waiting for me to tell you the right answer before you chimed in. Yes, congratulations, 41% of you. Gen Z wants greater meaning. And so this statistic, this data point will influence or kind of have this in the back of your mind as we go through this next strategy, because they do connect very well. All right, what do these 4 items have in common? I'm about to give you 4 situations, and I want you to think to yourself what these 4 things have in common. Are you ready? Scholarship fundraisers felt more motivated to secure donations when they had contact with scholarship recipients. Lifeguards were more vigilant after reading stories about people whose lives have been saved by lifeguards. Cooks were more motivated and worked harder when they saw those who would be eating their food. And radiologists were more accurate reading x-rays when showing a picture of the patient. Think to yourself, what do those 4 things have in common? I bet many of you are circling, getting really warmed to the commonality here. Some of you, I'm sure, got it. The commonality here is that workers were connected to the people benefiting from their labor. And when that happens, it improves performance, as we saw in each one of these scenarios. And they're from different industries, right? There's different types of individuals associated with these situations. So this is a really, really powerful point. So our first strategy to share with you as it relates to leading inclusively is to identify the beneficiaries of the labor. Connecting workers to the beneficiaries of their work creates more engagement, motivation, and it allows employees to transcend their task lists. So this is a generationally inclusive leadership tactic because at the core of humans, right, we want to understand who's benefiting from our labor, and it can elevate our work. It can create more meaning to our work, thus engaging Gen Z, if that's something of interest to you. So identify the beneficiaries of the labor. Now, the next question probably in your mind is, well, how do I do that? How do I identify the beneficiaries? I'm glad you asked. Simply ask why repeatedly. Ask why repeatedly. So here's how that might look. If you asked a group of folks that clean hotel rooms and you're trying to help them to identify the beneficiaries of their labor, you might ask them, why do you clean hotel rooms? And the response they're likely to give you is this: because that's what my boss tells me to do, right? Well, then you got to ask why repeatedly. And why does that matter? Because it keeps the rooms from getting dirty. And why does that matter? Because it makes the rooms more sanitary and more pleasant. And why does that matter? Well, because it provides clean space for customers to relax and rejuvenate. So finally, asking why repeatedly, we got to the beneficiaries of the labor. Thus, that creates more motivation, engagement, and that's what we're after. So identify the beneficiaries of the labor. I believe this is our last question poll. So if you haven't got one right, now's your chance. What leadership style best resonates with the emerging generations? What do you think? In the interest of time, I want to make sure we've got plenty of time for your questions. The correct answer is coaching. So most of you got it. Congratulations. Let's unpack this further. To understand why coaching is so important, we first have to understand that there's a leadership shift happening. So think about this. Think about yourself in this example. In the past, how did we gather information? It was from a single source. Information was centralized in the past, right? Either in an individual, in a book, in an institution, etc. But in the future, information is now decentralized. It's in the palm of our hand. And that changes how we should lead. So in the past, when information was centralized, the leadership approach was a top-down approach because one person had the information and they could disseminate it. And that's mostly what happened and mostly what worked. But now that information is decentralized, the game's changed. And so now our leadership approach should be more of a networked approach. And so if you're going to follow a more network approach, then coaching is the number one leadership style that effectively influences across generations. So coaching isn't a top-down, coaching is side-by-side. So let's break that down even further. The strategy here is to be a guide on the side. No longer is it about being a sage on stage, sharing information, bottling up, centralizing information, but being a guide on the side. So we got to coach each generation through their learnings, through their failures, through their successes. That's how we effectively coach. And that's how we can lead inclusively across generations. Because this is a fantastic strategy for younger generations leading up, is to be a coach. So you might be asking yourself, well, Ryan, how do I do that? How do I best be a coach? And it's very simple, but it's not easy. Here's how you do it. You resist advice giving and you ask more questions. That's it. And that's hard to do, isn't it? Because as a leader, you often see that train coming and you want to be able to give the right advice so that someone can avoid that obstacle. But that doesn't help the individual. So instead we need to ask more questions. And I would encourage you to ask questions like this. What's on your mind? That's oftentimes a smoke screen. So you have to ask, and what else? What's the real challenge here for you? How can I help you? And what was most useful or valuable here for you? So consider those questions as you're coaching. All right, so let's recap as our time's winding down. This is how you lead inclusively across generations. Generations, remember, are clues, not absolutes, but they're very big clues. Get to know generations better. Be more curious and less certain. And identify the beneficiaries of the labor. Ask why repeatedly. That's how you do it. And then lastly, be a guide on the side. Resist advice giving. Ask more questions. So these are a few helpful tips. I know we've had just a small amount of time together, but hopefully those are helpful in being a catalyst for you to lead more inclusively across generations. So let's jump into some Q&A. As you're thinking about your thoughts, I want to also ask this. Do you want these type of results? Performance increased by 17%, decision-making boosted by 20%, collaboration enhanced by 29%. I think I hear a resounding yes. So if you want these results, you've got to lead inclusively, right? And those that is the data around leading inclusively. Do you get those type of results? And if you're interested in going much further beyond this session with leading inclusively, we might be able to help. We have what we call Generations University. It helps workers thrive in a multi-generational workplace. And everyone that's engaged right now on this session, you're going to get free access to that. So you can train yourself or your team via digital courses. And we'd also do live workshops as well, person and slowly starting to be virtual, but also now slowly to be in person. So here's what you need to do. Text access to that number. And this is valid for 24 hours only. So do that. Be thinking about your questions. If you have more custom solutions, or if you just want to connect with any more questions, send me an email. There's my email. It's ryanj@syncelx.com. We'll also be following up after this webinar with all this information as well. So if you got questions, use the polling system that we've been using this whole time, and you can submit your questions right now. You can do that. And then everyone can actually vote on which questions you'd like to have us answer. Steve's going to help answer any questions that he can as well. So vote up or down, whatever questions you'd like us to answer and we're going to do our best to answer everything we can. So again, there's the text access to that number. There's my email, and we're going to pick somebody to get a free book. So Steve, is there someone that you've randomly selected that is going to get a
I
book
made
today?
it as official as I can make it. My birthday is on the 19th. It's my lucky number. So the 19th person on the list is Jack Moody. So congratulations, Jack Moody. We will follow up, and Ryan will send one of his amazing books your way.
Jack, I know Jack well. It's great to see you, Jack. Not see you, but great to have you here. All right. So what questions do you have? All right, keep pulling those in there. Where can we purchase the book? Oh, I love that. If you go to Amazon and search Ryan Jenkins Generations, that'll get you there. Or you can also go to my website, which is ryan-jenkins.com. So ryan-jenkins.com, and you can grab a book there as well. Thanks for asking. All right, so it looks like questions are rolling in now. The one at the top of the list is, if Gen Z doesn't get along very well with Gen Xers, should we make their leaders also from Gen Z instead of Gen X leaders? Good question. Ultimately, you want to put someone in a leadership role that is a capable leader, right? That checks all the boxes, that reflects the values and culture at your organization. I don't think you want to stipulate which generation they need to be from, but I think your thinking is appropriate. And a good way to kind of think about this is, if your goal is to attract or recruit Generation Z, then you'd like potentially those recruiters to be of that generation, or at least have recruiters and have Gen Zers inside the organization, perhaps be on campus, helping to gather interest or to provide information to Gen Z. So oftentimes generations of the same generations just have a little bit more commonality, so that connection can happen faster. So I think using it in a role like recruiting makes much more sense than perhaps more of a leadership role. So that would be my suggestion there. All right, the top response here is, what are common mistakes leaders make when they are ignorant to generational differences?
Hey, Ryan, can I
Yeah.
just really quick
Please.
tell my one most common mistake? So as I've led a lot of the workshops, and as I've done the work I've done with well over 1,000 leaders across different industries and organizations, really the biggest mistake, in my opinion, is leaders who say, they have to conform to us. Why do I have to conform to them? Right? It's been this way for a long time. We have our policies, our culture, our rules and regulations. Why are we now having to give up our stance to accommodate the younger generation? That, in my opinion, is the most common mistake, is that framework, that mindset that, they have to conform to us versus us conforming to them. And really, if you remember the slide that Ryan showed, in 2025, in 5 years from now, 75% of the working population will be in the majority. So that mindset is absolutely no longer going to be relevant. So I think removing that question from the arsenal of questions is a good step. And then Ryan, I know you got tons of other strategies and things that you can recommend to help with that also.
Yeah, it's a great point though, Steve. And I see that a lot too, is folks just, I think it's human nature, right? It's like, I've paid my dues. Now it's time for this next generation to pay their dues. And I'm trying to learn about them. Are they going to try to learn about me? And if you're in a leadership role, your role is to go first. You model, right? That's leadership. So, you go first. You be the one that gets to understand that generation more. And if you've got a solid team and you've made the right hires, they'll reciprocate that, right? And so as a leader, you go first. You got to do the hard work to roll up your sleeves to get the job done. A book comes to mind. Patrick Lencioni has a new book called The Motive, and it really helps leaders unearth why they're in a leadership role. And I think it would be really insightful to whoever asked that question, because I think that once you understand the why, it helps a little bit to start overcoming some of these generational differences. And the last thing I would say too is use generations as clues, not absolutes. And be wary of jumping to conclusions saying, well, all millennials or all Gen Z want remote work. It's likely that a lot of them do want that remote work, but don't make that conclusion. Spend some time asking the right questions. That might be using pulse surveys via Culture Amp, or Tiny Pulse is another good tool to use. But make sure you're in those conversations, really understanding what they want from that perspective, or communication perspective, et cetera.
Good.
All right, another great question here is, how can leaders lead up generations? And we're up on our time, so if you've got to go, we understand. We'll give you a recording of this webinar, but there's a lot of good questions here, so we'll hang on as long as we can here to answer all these questions, but no guilt if you got to go now. Thanks for being with us. How can leaders lead up generations? That's a great question. I think the best way is to do one of the strategies we taught, and that's to be a guide on the side. It's really difficult for the leadership dynamic when someone's younger leading someone that's older. And so this approach of humility, this approach of being a coach that's just asking the right questions, takes all the pressure off, right? No longer do you have to have all the answers. You're just the one asking the right questions, that's listening, that's taking a humble approach to it. That's what we've seen being the most effective way for younger leaders to lead up generations.
I would also,
Steve, do you have anything you'd like to weigh in?
Yeah, I would take it one step further. The word that I like to use is helpful. When you take a mindset of helpfulness, and your role is to help provide the resources, do everything you can to ensure that your team, especially if it's a team of more senior people who maybe have more tactical or technical knowledge with whatever the work is, when it comes from a genuine place of helpfulness, that's appreciated. And when that helpfulness turns into positive results and impact, then all of a sudden your credibility is boosted. And there is definitely a really important framework and mindset that you can take with regards to that. And I know, as someone who has done a lot of work in industries where I was always the youngest, coming in guns blazing, like I have all the newest, greatest knowledge, I have all this education, I have this, that, and the other thing, does not go well.
Yeah.
Humility is absolutely important, and helpfulness works really well.
Great point. And why we're seeing this right now is because for the first time ever, we have an emerging generation that's coming into the workforce that has skills and knowledge that previous generations don't have. And that's what's causing this tension and this rub. And so there's a ton of value in the emerging generation, and they have a lot to bring to the table. And so a lot of it's up to leaders to kind of create this environment where you can tap into that, as well as making sure that it's not, it doesn't give them too much confidence where they then start come guns ablazing, in your words, Steve. So all those things, great, helpful things. Hopefully that's helpful to everyone. The next question here is, I think coaching works best across all generations. So, but not necessarily with Gen Z. Do you agree or disagree? That's a great question. I would say when coaching done well, I would say it works for any generation. But I bet to whoever asked this question, Gen Z is probably looking for more specific action items or specific information, right? Because they're so green to the workforce that they're looking for perhaps more direction to get going. This is a highly ambitious bunch. They're highly resourceful. So oftentimes they're looking for information, or they're looking for resources that they can't get with the flick of their thumbs on an interconnected device, right? Or a flick of their thumbs on Google or YouTube. So they're looking for more wisdom or guidance from other generations. And I think it's perhaps this question is coming from that point where they're seeing that Gen Z is just wanting the answers so that they can go real quick. So taking a coaching approach, which might come to the side and ask right little questions, or asking more questions, might give Generation Z the sense that things they're impatient, right? They just want to get going. So you might have to adjust how you coach, but ultimately asking the right questions to get the individual to find the answer is ultimately making them a more productive and independent leader or independent worker. So that's ultimately the goal there of being a coach and asking the right questions. And then a good question to ask after a coaching session is, what was most valuable here for you? Because again, for that Gen Zer who might not have a lot of of experience with a healthy coaching relationship, you want them to verbalize to you, hey, this is what was so helpful. And in the back of their mind, they're going to think, this was really helpful. Next time I'm in a position or I find myself in a similar situation, I'm going to seek out this coaching relationship again so that I can have the right guidance and the right information to continue to move forward.
Yeah. And
Steve, anything to add?
So the question was, coaching works best across all generations. So not necessarily just Gen Z, meaning that all generations can benefit from coaching. And that's a resounding yes, absolutely. And even more so, if you are looking at some of the really insightful and innovative things companies are doing now, they're even introducing reverse mentoring, reverse coaching programs where they're having more junior employees coach more senior employees because, again, like Ryan said, employees now are coming into organizations with a totally different set of skills and knowledge and backgrounds. So finding ways to pair people together to learn from one another, and coaching, mentorship, however you want to label it, types of relationships is a very, very well-received trend that has worked for a lot of companies. So the more coaching, the more sharing, the more you can get people interacting with each other, driving each other towards a greater sense of achievement. It's a win-win.
Thanks, Steve. Well said. The next question here, what suggestions do you have for approaching social injustice conversations across multiple generations? Great question, and of course, very valid with everything going on right now. I think one of the best things to do is to create psychological safety. And in just a minute, Steve, I'm going to have you dig into that because I know that's something that you've taught a lot to our clients and groups about. But I think one of the big things, especially that we're seeing from Generation Z, is that they're looking for more emotionally intelligent leaders. Because as our work lives and our personal lives are intersecting, Gen Z is having a hard time figuring out, where does life stop and where does work pick up? And to them, it's all just work and life. And so they're not just leaving life stuff at the door when they come to work. Like, they're bringing their whole self. They're bringing all of their angst about what's going on in the future. So as leaders, we've got to be able to lean into this because they're looking to you. And if we can create more emotionally intelligent leaders and more emotionally intelligent organizations that can create environments where these type of conversations around social injustice can be had, you're not only going to be serving that individual and moving society forward, but you're going to be creating environments where people are not going to want to leave because they're craving this type of environments. And so if you can nail this and really make this a part of your organization, I think you're really setting yourself up for success. But Steve, tell us a little bit about psychological safety and how that might play into this.
Yeah, Charles Duhigg, the author of the book Smarter, Faster, Better, really did a nice job encapsulating what this research is. And Harvard started the research, and then Google made it famous because they did a really, really big, massive data dump on what they called Project Aristotle, where they figured out really what are the conditions that allow some teams to thrive and other teams to not find success. And at the root of what was leading some teams to be successful and other teams not, the conditions, the environment in which that team was operating was more important than even the team members themselves. And that environment was rooted in what they called psychological safety. It's basically the ability to be vulnerable, to share, to have ideas, to go back and forth with team members in this place where I can say what I want to say and not have fear of repercussions, not have fear that I'm going to be slandered, right? That we're really in this space that is safe. And when team members feel like they could be who they are naturally in this environment, because the environment is right for those conditions, that's when teams get to the next level. And that's when you can have really open dialogues. And that's when you can challenge thoughts and ideas and not feel vulnerable in a state, in a sense that you're going to have a hard time dealing with things. So psychological safety, there's a ton of research. Google, Charles Duhigg, psychological safety, Smarter, Faster, Better, really good resources to further dive into that topic.
Thanks, Steve. Great question, everybody. I've got the other questions to pull up on my device here. Do certain generations have a different mix of behavior or personality profiles, like DISC, et cetera? Or is it a fair mix in each generation? I would say there's a fair mix across the board. Right now, My wife and I are really into Enneagram. We're trying to figure out our numbers. If any of you are Enneagram fans out there, I'm a 1. No, I'm a 3. My wife's a 1. But the Enneagram has it boiled down to where there's 9 different personalities, and they've got some interesting research as to what they think the general population, human population, kind of how it breaks down across those different 9 personalities. So I would say in general, you're going to have those personalities across the board. But what's really fascinating about generations is the younger the generation, the more closely their behaviors and their expectation and their behaviors are across the world. And why is that? Well, it's because we're all connected. Yeah. So you think about this pandemic happening right now. It's really imprinting Generation Z. This is going to be their flagship event that's going to shape how they view the world and their behaviors moving forward. They're experiencing this much like a peer of theirs halfway across the world. And so we're going to start seeing some of these behaviors and expectations really be similar across the world as the generations get younger, because we're so connected now. So if your team is international or you're dealing with a lot of international folks, you can use these generational behaviors and expectations that can really start to overlay across boundaries. And the other thing to think about too, I like to use this reference. Generation Z they grew up being able to put a connected earpiece in and game on Xbox in real time with someone halfway around the world. So they've been connected with their global peers like never before. So boundaries and cultural differences are much different in the younger generations than they are the older generations. But back to your questions, personality is going to be a mixed bag across, but you're going to see how those personalities come out. The how of it's what's going to be different. And the behaviors and expectations around those different personalities are really going to be shaped and influenced by the generations. Steve, anything to add on that?
No, the only thing that I've noticed is the personalities tend to be most similar around roles, not so much generations. You get a bunch of engineers together, they tend to gravitate towards one of the personalities versus a bunch of salespeople versus a bunch of graphic designers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So regardless of your age, you're going to have, natural strengths and weaknesses and preferences one way or another based more on how you grew up than, the generation you're from.
All right, we'll take a few more questions and then we'll wrap things up for those that are hanging on with us. Let's see, what are the differences between Gen Z and millennials? I've identified 8 big differences. I won't go through all of those. If you search Ryan Jenkins, Gen Z versus millennials, you'll be able to find that article that I wrote for Inc.com. But one of them is around Gen Z is going to be much more cautious versus millennials who are very optimistic. So millennials grew up kind of in a world of abundance, and they were parented by baby boomers who were giving them, unlimited dreams and they can do anything. So millennials were very optimistic. Gen Z, however, is going to be very realistic. In fact, a majority of Gen Z can't remember a world prior to the Great Recession. And now a lot of them aren't going to be able to remember a world prior to COVID. So all these things have really impacted them, and some of the conversations that they were having and the social mood in the homes that they grew up in was much different. So they're going to be much more cautious than the optimistic generation. Around education, that's a big one. Millennials pursued formal education in a big way, in a very aggressive way. Hence now they have the most debt of any generation. Gen Z is strongly pushing against that, and they're thinking about how can I hack generation? How can I piece together a generation and perhaps get to work sooner? And they're also going to be looking at their employers and their leaders to provide more learning and development opportunities. And then the last example I'll give you, again, I've identified 8 big ones, is around communication. Millennials grew up with the age of social media, right? They were the catalyst to social media, and they perhaps relied a little bit too much maybe on digital communications and put aside a lot of the interpersonal skills that were still so valued. And I can't blame them. I'm a millennial, I can't blame it because that's highly efficient way of doing things. Gen Z, though, the research is indicating, the research that we've done, and there's a lot of other research that confirms this, Gen Z is looking for more face-to-face conversations. And so high tech is definitely going to be an expectation for Gen Z, but they're also looking for more interactions, right? And this is a very lonely generation. And so I think they're looking for more of that human connection and that the EQ that we talked about that they can't get in the digital space. So those are three big differences that we've seen. Hopefully that's helpful. All right, Steve, should we do one more? Then we'll wrap up.
Do it, partner.
Let's see. Listening skills seem to have been lost as generational mix has increased. This is a huge issue for boomers who have learned to coach by listening, building, responding. Oh, it's just a comment. Great comment.
Hey, can I make a comment on that?
Please.
I don't know if it's necessarily that listening skills have been lost. The change is now brevity has become more important than ever. We could all listen, but the amount of time that we're used to listening because of all of the distractions that we are facing day in and day out, the pull of attention that we get from all of these different people in all of these different ways has forced us now to listen in chunks and want things in small doses. So listening is still very much a skill set. Really long-winded stories, all of a sudden it's like, boom, tuned out. This is past my capacity for focus and attention from a listening standpoint. I'm checking out. Brevity has become more important than ever, right? So that's my statement to that comment.
Great point. Love that. All right, this is the last question. And don't forget to text access to that number to get some more information about how we might be able to help in this conversation around inclusive leadership across generations. If you've got questions 2 months from now, send me an email. You've got my email there. I'm here to help. Steve and I want to add as much value as we can outside of this time that we've got together with you and beyond. So keep in touch. Let us know how we can continue to serve you. Last question is let's see here. How do you coach sales teams that are Gen Zs that sell to customers from other generations? We've been having a lot of conversations recently on how to sell across generations in the digital space, because it almost seems like this cross-generational selling is amplified now that we're all in these remote environments. So a few things to keep in mind, I would say, is to defer to the communicatee. So use generations as clues, right? So if there's a Gen Zer that's trying to sell to a baby boomer, they're probably not going to want to show up in their direct messages on social, right? They might actually need to pick up the phone or schedule a face-to-face when safe, of course. So defer to the communicatee and use generations as clues. Another thing is to mirror your communications. So if a Gen Z sends an email to a baby boomer, a sales email, and that baby boomer calls them, they're not going to then respond with that in response to that voicemail via email. You're going to want to respond to a voicemail because, again, you're deferring to the communicatee. And so mirroring your communications in that regard is helpful. And the last thing I'd say too is be wary of your emotional intent, because when we're communicating digitally, which of course Gen Z in sales positions, they're highly resourceful and they're going to be able to use digital to a capacity perhaps like no other generation. But it's really easy to misconstrue information if we're not taking the time to use just the right descriptive words to make sure our emotional intent of the communications is clear. So sometimes we got to spend a little bit more time on the front end being clear about our communications, especially since they're digital. So those would be a few tips I would have. Any insights from you, Steve?
Those were great, Ryan.
All right, gang. Thank you so much for your time. We want to end with this. Simply, we know leading is challenging. Perhaps now more than ever, it is challenging. It's also extremely rewarding. And we know that you want to get it right, and we can help. So visit sync.lx.com to explore how we might be able to help you in that journey. And until then, thank you for your time and attention. Have a great day, everyone.